there is a moment you might recognize. You're sitting somewhere ordinary. A kitchen table, a park bench, a car parked outside a grocery store. And the quiet around you has a texture to it. It isn't peaceful. It's heavy. It presses against your chest in a way that's hard to explain because it doesn't look like anything from the outside. You're not bleeding. You're not feverish. You're just alone. And something in your body knows, at a level deeper than thought, that this aloneness is not okay. That it is costing you something. That it has been costing you something for a long time. Most people will dismiss that feeling. They'll tell you to join a club, download an app, put yourself out there, as if loneliness were a logistical problem with a logistical solution, as if the answer was simply more proximity to other human beings. But what the science is now revealing, and what many people who live with chronic loneliness have always sensed in their bones, is that something far more profound is happening. Something that goes beyond mood, beyond social awkwardness, beyond the simple arithmetic of having or not having friends. Scientists have discovered that chronic loneliness physically rewires your brain, and the changes they're finding are nearly identical to those found in trauma survivors. Let that settle for a moment. Not that loneliness feels traumatic, not that it's metaphorically similar to trauma, that the neural architecture, the actual physical structure and function of the brain changes in ways that mirror what happens to people who have survived abuse, combat, profound loss. The brain of someone who has been chronically lonely looks in measurable, documented ways like a brain that has been through something terrible. Because it has. This video is for anyone who has ever felt the weight of that quiet. Anyone who has moved through the world feeling slightly outside of it, watching other people's ease with each other through glass you couldn't seem to break. Anyone who has wondered in the small hours of the night whether something is fundamentally wrong with them, whether they are somehow inexplicably unlovable, unchosen, invisible. You are not broken, but you may be carrying damage you didn't know had a name. And giving something a name, understanding what it actually is and what it is actually doing to you, is the first step towards something that feels very much like relief. Let's begin with what loneliness actually is, because most of us have been thinking about it wrong. We tend to think of loneliness as an emotion, a feeling that comes and goes, like sadness or anxiety, something that exists in the mind and can therefore be resolved by the mind. But researchers at the University of Chicago, including the pioneering neuroscientist John Cacioppo, spent decades studying loneliness and arrived at a conclusion that fundamentally reframes how we should understand it. Loneliness is not primarily a feeling. It is a biological signal. It is your nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do. Think about hunger. Hunger isn't just an emotion. It's a survival mechanism. Your body sends a signal, urgent, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore, to tell you that you need something you cannot live without. The discomfort of hunger exists to motivate you to seek food. Without that signal, your ancestors would have simply forgotten to eat and died. Loneliness works the same way. It is your nervous system sending a distress signal, urgent, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore, to tell you that you are missing something you cannot survive without. Social connection. The discomfort of loneliness exists to motivate you to seek other people. Without that signal, your ancestors would have wandered away from the group, become vulnerable to predators, and died. We are not solitary creatures who learned to tolerate each other. We are profoundly, biologically social animals who evolved in groups, survived in groups, and whose nervous systems are calibrated to treat isolation as a life-threatening emergency. The pain of loneliness is not weakness. It is not neediness. It is your body doing its job with extraordinary precision. But here is where it gets complicated. Here is where the science becomes something that should stop us in our tracks. That biological signal, the one designed to push you back toward connection, was built for a world where isolation was temporary, where you might be separated from your tribe for a day, a week, maybe a season, and then find your way back. It was not built for months or years of chronic social disconnection. It was not built for modern life, where you can be surrounded by millions of people and still feel utterly, devastatingly alone. And when the signal runs continuously, when your nervous system is in a constant state of social emergency with no resolution in sight, something shifts. The alarm doesn't turn off, and a nervous system that cannot turn off its alarm begins to change. This is what chronic loneliness does to the brain. Not theoretically, not metaphorically, physically. If this channel is giving you language for things you've carried without words, please consider subscribing and liking this video. It helps this kind of content reach the people who need it most. Cacioppo's research, along with subsequent studies from neuroscientists around the world, has documented a cascade of neurological changes that occur in people experiencing chronic loneliness. And they are significant. They are the kind of changes that if you saw them on a brain scan without context, you might assume belonged to someone who had lived through a war. The first change happens in the threat detection system, specifically in a region of the brain called the amygdala, which functions as your internal alarm system, constantly scanning your environment for danger. In people who are chronically lonely, the amygdala becomes hyperactive. It becomes sensitized. It starts seeing threat where there isn't any. A neutral facial expression reads as hostile. A moment of silence in a conversation feels like rejection. A text message that goes unanswered for a few hours becomes evidence of abandonment. The lonely brain is a brain on high alert, interpreting the social world through a lens of danger, because at a neurological level, it has learned that the social world is not safe. And here is the part that breaks your heart a little, because it is so deeply unfair. This hypervigilance, this constant scanning for rejection, this hair-trigger sensitivity to social threat makes it harder to connect, not easier. The very thing your brain does to protect you from further loneliness ends up perpetuating it. You become more guarded, more defensive, more likely to interpret ambiguous social signals as negative. more likely to withdraw before you can be rejected. The neuroscience of loneliness contains one of the cruelest ironies in human biology. The brain changes that loneliness creates are the same changes that make loneliness harder to escape. This is what psychologists call a maladaptive feedback loop. And it is not a character flaw. It is not a personality defect. It is your brain doing the only thing it knows how to do with a threat that never resolves: building walls. The second neurological change involves something called the default mode network, which is the network of brain regions that activates when you're not focused on a specific task. When you're daydreaming, reflecting, imagining the future, thinking about other people. In most people, the default mode network is where social cognition lives, where you mentally simulate other people's thoughts and feelings, where you process your relationships, where you make sense of the social world. In chronically lonely people, research shows that the default mode network becomes dysregulated. It becomes dominated by rumination, by repetitive, circular thinking about social failure, about rejection, about all the ways connection has not worked. The mind, left to wander, wanders back to the wound, again and again and again. If you have ever found yourself lying awake, replaying a social interaction from 3 years ago, examining it for evidence of what you did wrong, you know what this feels like from the inside. It feels like something you're doing to yourself, a bad habit, a failure of discipline. But it is not. It is your default mode network, altered by loneliness, doing what altered brains do. It is a symptom, not a character flaw. The third change is perhaps the most alarming, and it is the one that draws the clearest line between chronic loneliness and trauma. It involves the brain's stress response system, specifically the production and regulation of cortisol, which is your primary stress hormone. In people experiencing chronic loneliness, cortisol levels are elevated, not occasionally, chronically, persistently. The body is running in a low-grade state of emergency all the time because the nervous system has registered a threat, the absence of social safety, and cannot find resolution. Prolonged cortisol elevation is not benign. It damages the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for memory and learning. It suppresses the immune system. It increases inflammation throughout the body. It disrupts sleep architecture, making deep, restorative sleep harder to achieve. It accelerates cellular aging. Researchers studying the biology of loneliness have found that chronically lonely people show measurable differences in gene expression, specifically in genes related to immune function and inflammatory response. The loneliness is not just in your head, it is in your cells. This is the same cortisol dysregulation found in survivors of complex trauma, the same immune suppression, the same inflammatory patterns, the same disrupted sleep, the same hippocampal changes. When researchers compare the biological profiles of chronically lonely people and trauma survivors, the overlap is not incidental. It is striking. Loneliness, sustained over time, is a form of chronic stress that the body experiences with the same seriousness as a threat to physical safety. Because evolutionarily, it was. Take a moment with that. If you have been chronically lonely, not for a week, not for a bad month, but for years, Your body has been living in a state of emergency for years. Your brain has been rewiring itself around that emergency, and you have been doing this while also trying to function, to work, to appear fine, to not burden anyone with something that doesn't even look like a wound from the outside. That is extraordinary. That is a kind of endurance that deserves recognition, not pity. Recognition. Now let's talk about what this actually feels like from the inside, because the neuroscience is important, but it can feel abstract. And what you may need more than abstract understanding is to hear your own experience described back to you with accuracy. There is a particular quality to the loneliness of someone who doesn't have close friendships, and it is different from the loneliness of, say, someone who is temporarily separated from people they love. It has a different texture. It is not the sharp ache of missing someone specific. It is more like a low hum, a background frequency that you've lived with so long you've almost stopped noticing it, except that it colors everything. It makes joy feel slightly muted, like you're experiencing it through a filter. It makes achievements feel hollow, because there is no one to share them with who would really understand what they cost you. It makes ordinary moments, a beautiful sunset, a funny thing that happened, a thought you had that surprised you, feel like they're disappearing into air, unwitnessed, uncollected, gone. Psychologists call this the absence of shared meaning. One of the core functions of close friendship is that it allows us to process our experience with another person, to have our perceptions reflected back, to feel that what we observe and feel and think matters to someone else. Without that, there is a strange sense that your inner life is happening in a vacuum. You are having experiences, but they are not quite real in the way that witnessed experiences are real. You exist, but you feel strangely unconfirmed. And then there is the invisibility, the particular pain of moving through a world where people look past you, through you, around you, where you could disappear for days and no one would notice, where you have learned, slowly and painfully, not to expect to be remembered, not to expect to be sought out, not to expect the phone to ring, where you have become so accustomed to your own company that you have developed an entire inner world, rich, complex, detailed, that no one else has ever seen, because no one has ever asked. If any of this is landing for you, I'd genuinely love to know. When did you first start to recognize this pattern in yourself? And was there a moment when you realized the loneliness wasn't a personal failing, but something that had been shaped by your history? Share it in the comments if you feel comfortable. You might be giving someone else the words they've been looking for. For many people who live with chronic loneliness, there is a layer of shame that sits on top of everything else. Because we live in a culture that treats social success as a measure of personal worth. Having friends, being liked, being chosen, these are coded as evidence that you are a good person, a worthy person, a person who matters. And so the absence of friendship becomes evidence of the opposite. Something must be wrong with you. You must be too much, or not enough, or fundamentally difficult to love. You must have done something or failed to do something that explains why the connections that seem to come so naturally to others have never quite come to you. This is the internalization that psychologists describe when they talk about social exclusion. It is not just that you don't have friends. It is that you have absorbed the absence of friends as information about your worth as a human being. And that absorption, that quiet, persistent belief that you are somehow less than, is one of the most corrosive things that chronic loneliness does to the self. But here is what the research actually shows, and it is important because it directly contradicts the story you may have been telling yourself. The factors that determine whether someone ends up chronically lonely are overwhelmingly structural, circumstantial, and neurological. They have very little to do with whether someone is fundamentally likable or worthy of connection. People end up chronically lonely because of adverse childhood experiences that disrupted their early attachment development, because of social anxiety, which is itself often rooted in early experiences of rejection or unpredictability that makes social situations feel genuinely dangerous, because of neurodevelopmental differences, autism, ADHD, sensory processing differences that make the unspoken social rules that neurotypical people navigate intuitively feel like a foreign language, because of depression, which creates withdrawal and isolation that then create more depression in a cycle that is almost impossible to break from the inside, because of geography, poverty, disability, caregiving responsibilities, or any number of life circumstances that simply do not leave room for the kind of sustained, reciprocal investment that deep friendship requires. You did not end up lonely because you are unlovable. You ended up lonely because something, or a combination of somethings, made connection harder for you than it is for other people. And then your brain, doing exactly what brains do, adapted to that difficulty in ways that made it harder still. The shame is not warranted. The shame is a symptom. There is a concept in psychology called rejection sensitivity, and it is worth understanding because it explains so much of what chronic loneliness feels like from the inside. Rejection sensitivity is a heightened, anxious expectation of social rejection that develops in response to repeated experiences of being excluded or not chosen. People with high rejection sensitivity are not being paranoid. They are not catastrophizing for no reason. They have learned through real experience that social situations often end in pain, and so their nervous system, trying to protect them, becomes exquisitely attuned to early warning signs of that pain. The problem is that this attunement, like the amygdala hyperactivation we discussed earlier, tends to generate false positives. It finds rejection where there isn't any. It reads a busy friend's slow text response as a sign of fading interest. It reads a group's laughter as laughter at you. It reads an invitation to a party as a pity invitation, extended out of obligation rather than genuine desire. And so the person with rejection sensitivity either avoids social situations altogether or enters them in a state of such heightened vigilance that they cannot relax into the naturalness that connection requires. They are always slightly braced for impact, always monitoring for the moment when the other shoe will drop. And here is the devastating part. That bracing, that vigilance, that slight guardedness that never quite goes away. Other people can feel it. Not consciously, not judgmentally, but at the level of the subtle social cues that human beings are extraordinarily sensitive to. And so the very protection mechanism that rejection sensitivity creates, the emotional armor, can inadvertently create the distance that makes genuine connection harder to achieve. Not because you are doing anything wrong, because your nervous system is doing something it learned to do to keep you safe. This is not your fault. This is your brain, shaped by your history, trying to protect you with the only tools it has. And understanding that, really understanding it, not just intellectually, but in your body, can begin to loosen something, can begin to create the tiniest bit of space between you and the story that you are the problem. Let's talk about what chronic loneliness does beyond the brain, because the effects ripple outward in ways that most people never connect back to their source. Research consistently shows that chronic loneliness is associated with significantly elevated risk of depression and anxiety, which most people would expect. But it is also associated with elevated risk of cardiovascular disease, with higher rates of dementia in older adults, with impaired immune function that makes you more vulnerable to illness and slower to recover, with disrupted sleep that compounds every other physical and mental health challenge. A landmark meta-analysis of studies on social isolation found that loneliness increases the risk of premature death by approximately 26%. Another study found that the health impact of loneliness is comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. We do not treat loneliness like a public health crisis. We treat it like a personal failure. But the numbers are clear. Chronic loneliness is not a mood. It is a condition with measurable, serious, life-shortening consequences. And the people living with it deserve the same compassion and the same urgency that we extend to any other serious health challenge. There is something else the research reveals, something that speaks directly to the experience of people who have spent years without close friendships. And it is this: the brain does not distinguish between physical pain and social pain as cleanly as we might assume. A study by Naomi Eisenberger and colleagues at UCLA used brain imaging to show that social rejection activates the same neural regions as physical pain, specifically the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, which processes the distress component of physical injury. When you are excluded, when you are rejected, when you feel the ache of loneliness, your brain is registering something that, at a neurological level, is not metaphorically painful. It is literally painful. The same circuitry, the same regions, the same kind of signal. This is why telling someone who is lonely to simply think positively, to toughen up, to stop being so sensitive is not just unhelpful. It is asking them to override a pain signal with willpower. It is the equivalent of telling someone with a broken arm to stop complaining and use it normally. The pain is real. The wound is real. It simply isn't visible. And perhaps that invisibility is one of the hardest parts. Because when you carry something that doesn't show, when your suffering has no outward markers, no bandage, no cast, no fever. The world does not accommodate it. You are expected to function normally, to show up, perform, produce, smile. And so you do. Because what is the alternative? And the performance of normalcy, sustained over years, is itself exhausting in a way that is very difficult to explain to someone who has not lived it. You are not just lonely. You are lonely while pretending not to be. You are in pain while making sure no one can tell. And that double labor, the loneliness and the concealment of the loneliness, compounds everything. If you have been doing this, carrying this weight quietly, performing fineness while something inside you aches, I want you to hear this clearly. That is not weakness. That is an extraordinary amount of strength applied to an impossible task. And you have been doing it, probably, for longer than anyone knows. What has helped you most in those moments when the concealment felt heaviest? Was there something that finally gave you permission to stop pretending, even just for a moment? Leave it in the comments. Someone reading this at 2 in the morning needs to hear what you found. Now let's talk about something that the source of most popular content on this topic tends to either skip over or romanticize, and it is important to address it honestly. There is a narrative that gets told about solitude, about people who exist outside the social mainstream, that frames it as secretly powerful. The lone wolf, the misunderstood genius, the person whose solitude is really a form of superiority, a refusal to engage in shallow connections, a sign of extraordinary inner depth. And there is something real in that narrative. Solitude can be generative, and people who spend significant time alone do often develop capacities for self-reflection and independent thinking that are genuinely valuable. History does offer examples of people who produced remarkable things in relative isolation. But that narrative can also become a way of not looking directly at the pain, a way of reframing suffering as strength so that we don't have to sit with the fact that it is suffering. And while reframing can be genuinely helpful, it can also become a defense mechanism, a way of protecting yourself from the grief of what you don't have by insisting that you don't really need it anyway. The truth is more complex. Solitude can be both genuinely enriching and genuinely painful. The same person can have developed real depth and self-knowledge through their years of aloneness and also be carrying real wounds from the same years. These things are not mutually exclusive. You do not have to choose between honoring what solitude has given you and acknowledging what chronic loneliness has cost you. Both can be true at once, and the part that has cost you something deserves to be grieved, not just reframed. There is a concept in psychology called disenfranchised grief. Grief for losses that society does not recognize as legitimate losses, that therefore go unmourned and unacknowledged. The grief of childlessness by circumstance. The grief of a relationship that was never officially a relationship. The grief of a life you imagined and didn't get to live. And there is, I think, a profound disenfranchised grief in the experience of chronic loneliness. The grief for the friendships that didn't form, for the conversations that didn't happen, for the person who would have known you if things had been different, for all the ordinary moments, the inside jokes, the shared meals, the being known over time, that you have not had. That grief is real. It deserves space. It deserves acknowledgement, not because sitting in grief is the destination, but because grief that is not allowed to exist does not go away. It goes underground, where it shapes everything from below, invisible and unprocessed. So let's make space for it here. If you have lost years to loneliness, if you have moved through the world feeling unseen, unchosen, unwitnessed, that is a real loss. It is not a sign of your inadequacy. It is not evidence that you are unlovable. It is a wound, and wounds deserve care, not concealment. Here is what the research suggests about the path forward, and I want to be honest that this is not a simple answer, because chronic loneliness and its neurological effects are not simple problems. The brain changes that loneliness creates, the hypervigilant amygdala, the dysregulated stress response, the rejection sensitivity, do not resolve simply by being around more people. In fact, research by Cacioppo and others found that for chronically lonely people, forced social interaction without addressing the underlying neurological and psychological patterns can actually increase distress rather than relieve it. More proximity is not the same as more connection, and connection, real, felt, safe connection, is what the nervous system is actually seeking. What does seem to help, according to the research, is working directly with the threat detection patterns that loneliness has created. Cognitive approaches that help identify and gently challenge the automatic negative interpretations of social signals. Practices that regulate the nervous system, that help the body learn, slowly and through repeated experience, that it is safe to relax the vigilance. Therapeutic relationships, where the experience of being genuinely seen and understood by another person begins to create new neural pathways around what social connection can feel like. Small, low-stakes social experiences where the risk of rejection is manageable and the opportunity to experience positive connection is real. None of this is fast. None of it is linear. And I want to be honest about that, because false promises of quick transformation are not respect. They are a different kind of abandonment. The nervous system that has been shaped by years of loneliness will not be reshaped in a weekend. But it can be reshaped. The brain is plastic. It changes in response to experience. And new experiences of safety, of being seen, of connection that does not end in rejection, can, over time, begin to shift the patterns that loneliness built. This is what neuroscientists call experience-dependent neuroplasticity. The same mechanism that allowed loneliness to rewire your brain can allow healing to rewire it back. Not to what it was before. You cannot unknow what you have lived, but to something new, something that carries the depth and self-knowledge that solitude gave you, while also being capable of the openness that connection requires. And here is something important to understand about that process. It does not require you to become someone different. It does not require you to suddenly become extroverted or socially effortless or comfortable in large groups. The research does not suggest that what lonely people need is to become more like people who find social connection easy. What it suggests is that they need safety. They need experiences that teach the nervous system that the risk of reaching out is survivable. That rejection, when it happens, is not catastrophic. That there are people in the world who will receive them with care. You deserve to find those people. Not because you have fixed yourself, not because you have become easier to love, but because you were always worthy of being found. The difficulty was never that you were unlovable. The difficulty was that your nervous system learned from real experience that love was not safe. And that is a thing that can change. Not easily, not all at once, but it can change. If you are watching this and recognizing yourself, if the description of the hyper-vigilant brain, the internalized worthlessness, the ache of being unwitnessed, the grief of years spent on the outside of connection, if any of this has landed in your chest with the specific weight of recognition, I want you to know something. You have not been imagining it. The pain is real, and it is documented, and it has a name, and it has been studied by some of the most rigorous researchers in neuroscience and psychology. You are not too sensitive. You are not broken. You are not unlovable. You are a human being whose nervous system responded with perfect biological logic to an experience of social deprivation. And the wounds that created are real wounds, even though they don't show. The fact that you are still here, still curious, still willing to look directly at something this painful in search of understanding, that is not nothing. That is, in fact, a form of courage that deserves to be named. Most people look away from the things that hurt. You are looking toward this one, and looking toward something clearly with understanding rather than shame is always the beginning of something. You are not alone in your loneliness. That sounds paradoxical, but it is true. Research suggests that loneliness is one of the most prevalent experiences in contemporary life, affecting people across every demographic, every age group, every geography. There are people watching this video right now who have been carrying the exact weight you have been carrying, who have felt the exact ache you have felt, who have had the exact thoughts you have had in the small hours of the night. They have just been quiet about it, the way you have been quiet about it, because the shame of loneliness is part of what loneliness does. The silence is part of the wound, and breaking it, even here, even in the comments of a YouTube video, even in the small act of admitting to yourself that yes, this is what I have been living. Breaking it is something. It is not everything, but it is something. If this video has given you language for something you have been carrying without words, if it has made something that felt like a personal failing feel, even slightly, more like a human experience that deserves compassion rather than shame, then something real has happened here. Understanding is not healing, but it is the beginning of the path toward it, and you deserve to be on that path. If there is someone in your life who has been carrying this quietly, someone whose loneliness you've sensed but never quite had the words to reach, consider sharing this video with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for another person is hand them the language for something they've been suffering through in silence. That act of sharing can open a conversation that needed to happen, or simply let someone know they are not as invisible as they feared. If you feel safe to do so, share something in the comments, not because you owe anyone your story, but because somewhere out there, someone else is reading the comments section of this video in the middle of the night, looking for evidence that they are not the only one. Your words, however small, could be that evidence for them. That is not a small thing. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being willing to look at something this honest. And whatever you are carrying, whatever quiet weight has been yours to hold, I hope you carry it a little more gently now. There is a video on this channel that connects deeply to what we've explored today, the psychology of people who need emotional safety before physical closeness. If the idea that your nervous system learned to protect itself from connection resonated with you, that video will help you understand exactly why safety has to come before closeness, and what that actually looks like in practice.